The creaking wooden gate groaned open in the dying light as a lone young woman stepped into a homestead, drowning in despair. The sun dipped behind the distant hills, painting everything in weary gold. There stood Emeka, a once strong man now shattered, clutching a whimpering baby in his arms. Beside him, his 6-year-old daughter watched the stranger with eyes far too hardened for any child. The kitchen was dark, the hearth stone cold, and the entire house smelled of neglect, not food. In that moment of total desperation, Ada took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change their destinies forever. "If you let me stay, I can make dinner." What looked like nothing more than a simple offer from a hungry traveler became one of the most powerful, heart-melting stories of redemption, healing, and found family these dusty paths have ever known. My dear friends, if you believe God sometimes sends the exact right person into our lives the moment hope is almost gone, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel, activate the bell icon so you never miss a story, and tell me in the comments, from which corner of the world are you listening today? In the villages of the countryside, in olden times, stories like these were shared among rivers and dusty paths. The path that cut through that part of the bushland had no name on maps because maps didn't bother with places where the world seemed to have forgotten to arrive. It was a wide, red dirt track pressed between rounded hills covered in dry grass. And at that hour, hardly anyone was seen on it. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the silence was only broken by the sad cooing of a dove hidden in some thicket. Ada had been trekking that dusty path for almost 3 days, pausing by streams to quench her thirst and resting beneath the shea trees when dusk settled. Her worn leather bag bumped against her hip with each stride, and within it she carried little that the world would deem precious. But everything Ada truly possessed, a change of clothes, a bone comb from her mother, and a hardcover notebook where her mother's tiny script recorded recipes that came from far away, from grandmother to daughter, from daughter to granddaughter. Ada was 22 years old, but she carried in her body and soul the weight of someone who had already lived too many lives in too little time. Her father, a cattle herder by trade and a wanderer by nature, died in a fall from a horse when she was still a child, leaving behind only debts and the warm nostalgia of a man who spent more time on the road than in his home. Her mother, a washerwoman with cracked hands and a gentle heart, held on firmly for 2 more years until tuberculosis did what sorrow had failed to achieve. Ada was left alone at 16 and was taken in by a great aunt named Ngozi, who lived in a rented room at the back of a lodging house and made a living with small sewing jobs. Aunt Ngozi was a rigid woman on the outside, but she had a quiet affection that showed in her gestures. And it was she who taught Ada to transform little into much in a kitchen, to stretch a handful of flour into food for 3 days, to make a beef bone into a broth that could revive even the sick. Ada cared for Aunt Ngozi for 5 years, watching her fade away slowly like a candle burning down without haste. When her aunt's heart finally found rest one early March morning, Ada realized she had no one else in the world. The owner of the room appeared before the burial to ask when she would vacate. There was no inheritance, no distant relative, no man waiting. There was only the road and the stubborn hope that somewhere a young woman who knew how to work was needed. She gathered what little she had in her bag. She tucked her mother's recipe notebook among her clothes, like a sacred relic, and left without looking back, because looking back was a luxury that people without a home could not afford. The homestead appeared at the end of that afternoon like a mirage in the middle of nowhere. Ada almost didn't believe it when she saw the wooden gate, the wide, dusty compound, the white-walled house with a tiled roof, the pen with a few lean cows, and a fenced area where chickens pecked aimlessly. It was not a rich place, but it was a place of people, and people meant the possibility of a plate of food and a corner to sleep. She paused at the edge of the path. She tidied her braid that the wind had partially undone. She brushed the dust from her light-colored dress, which was no longer so light after 3 days of walking, and took a deep breath before pushing open the gate. The creak of the wood echoed through the compound and was enough to draw the attention of whoever was there. The first thing Ada saw was the girl. She was sitting on a low stool near the chicken coop peeling cassava with a seriousness that did not suit any child, for it was the expression of someone who had learned that the world is not a safe place. She had brown hair cut to her chin, a simple dress of worn fabric, and a gaze that measured the stranger from head to toe without speaking, without making a sign, without smiling. Ada was about to open her mouth to speak when she heard the crying. It came from inside the house, a soft whimper of a baby whose voice was worn out from crying so much. And along with it, the man appeared. Emeka emerged from the doorway like someone coming out of an endless battle. He was tall, with broad shoulders and large hands of one who had worked the land since he could remember. But everything about him screamed fatigue. His beard was days unshaven, his wrinkled linen shirt had a milk stain on the shoulder, and his sunken eyes carried that kind of exhaustion that cannot be cured with a night's sleep, because it wasn't just his body that was spent. In his left arm, he held a baby of about 7 or 8 months, wrapped in a cloth that had seen better days. And the child squirmed and whined with that restlessness of someone who needs something the father doesn't know how to give. Emeka looked at Ada with surprise and something akin to distrust, because in those days, a woman alone on the road was something that raised questions. Ada swallowed her nervousness and spoke in the firmest voice she could, apologizing for the bother and saying she just wanted a glass of water to continue her journey. Emeka descended the 2 veranda steps carefully, balancing the baby who wouldn't stop moving, and replied that there was water, but she would have to go in and serve herself, as he couldn't let go of the child. Ada thanked him and walked towards the house, passing the girl who remained on the stool, following the stranger's every step with those watchful eyes. When Ada entered the kitchen, what she saw twisted her heart in a way she knew, because it was the same sad disarray she had seen in Aunt Ngozie's house in her last months, when the old woman could no longer keep things in order. The wood-fired hearth was cold with accumulated ash from days past. Dirty pots were piled in the stone sink, dried food scraps stuck to the table. There was no sign of dinner being prepared, no smell of beans on the fire, no bread cooling on a cloth. She looked at the clay pot in the corner, poured herself water and drank slowly, thinking. Then she looked again at the kitchen, the pots, the dead hearth, the window through which she saw Emeka in the compound trying to calm the baby without success, while the girl returned to peeling cassava with mechanical movements. Ada thought about the road that awaited her outside, about the uncertain villages, about the doors that might open or not, and she thought about that house that needed someone just as she needed a place. The decision formed before reason could argue. She left the kitchen, went to the veranda where Emeka had sat with the baby, and spoke plainly without asking permission from her own courage. "Mr. Emeka, I saw the hearth is cold and the children haven't eaten dinner. If you let me stay, I can make dinner. And if you like the dinner, we can discuss the rest." Emeka looked at that young woman with disheveled braid and dusty dress who had appeared out of nowhere, offering food like someone offering salvation, and felt a mix of astonishment and distrust battling with the exhaustion that he could no longer bear. He should have said no. He should have politely thanked her and told the girl to continue on her way. But the baby was crying in his arm. His daughter was outside peeling cassava alone, like a miniature old woman, and it had been 3 days since any of them had eaten a proper meal. The shame of admitting he couldn't cope weighed less than his children's hunger. He nodded briefly, and Ada didn't wait for him to change his mind. She entered the kitchen like someone entering a work camp, rolled up her sleeves, and started with the hearth. She cleaned out the old ash, arranged the firewood stacked in the corner, and with the skill of someone who had done it all her life, lit the fire on the first try. As the flames gained strength, she rummaged in the cupboard and found soaked beans that no one had cooked, a piece of smoked fish, cornmeal, a few eggs, and the cassava the girl was peeling outside. It wasn't much, but Ada had learned from her mother that cooking isn't about abundance, it's about knowledge. In less than an hour, the kitchen of that homestead smelled of real food for the first time in many months. The beans bubbled thickly in the iron pot. The boiled cassava steamed in a serving dish, fried eggs glistened in the black pan, and the aroma spread through the entire house like a living presence pushing sadness out of every corner. The girl was the first to appear at the kitchen door, drawn by the smell like a wild animal sniffing out food. She stood there watching Ada with that mix of hunger and distrust that broke one's heart. Ada didn't force conversation. She simply set the table with what she found, placed 3 plates, and served the food in silence as if she did this every day, as if she had belonged to that kitchen forever. Emeka entered with the baby in his arm, paused at the door, and stared at the set table with an expression Ada couldn't read, but which seemed like pain mixed with something else. He sat down slowly, settled the child on his lap, and looked at the plate as if he couldn't believe it was real. They ate almost without speaking. The girl, whom Ada would discover was named Amara, ate everything on her plate and kept looking at the pot with a hunger that wasn't just for food. Ada served more without asking, and the girl accepted without thanking, but ate every mouthful with an attentiveness that spoke more than any words. Emeka ate slowly, chewing carefully, and Ada realized he was fighting against something within himself, against an emotion that showed. The baby, who had calmed with the warmth of the kitchen and the smell of food, fell asleep on his father's lap with his mouth slightly open. And when dinner ended and silence settled in that warm kitchen, Emeka looked at Ada and simply said that the small room at the back was empty and that she could stay that night and they would talk in the morning. Ada thanked him with a nod and collected the dishes. She washed everything in silence while Emeka took the children to their rooms. And when she was alone in the kitchen, she heard the sounds of the homestead settling for the night. The distant bleating of the cattle, the wind in the garden trees, the crackling of the last embers in the hearth. Before going to the small room, her eyes stopped on a photograph hanging on the living room wall between a wooden crucifix and a dried sprig of rosemary. It was the portrait of a young woman, with light eyes and dark hair, with a serene smile that seemed to bless the entire house. Ada looked at that face and felt something strange stir within her chest, a feeling that was neither sadness nor joy, but something she couldn't yet name. She quickly averted her gaze and went to the room where she lay on the narrow bed with a thin mattress and closed her eyes, listening to the house's breathing around her. That night, for the first time in weeks, no one cried in that homestead, neither the baby, nor the girl, nor the man. And Ada, who had nowhere to lay her head that morning, fell asleep feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, that cold hearth had been waiting for her. The sun was still sleeping behind the hills when Ada opened her eyes on that first morning. Her body ached from the journey, but her mind was already awake before the rest because the mind of a woman who needs to prove her worth does not rest well. She got up, put on the same dress she had washed the night before, and hung by the window, and walked barefoot through the dark hallway to the kitchen. Everything was just as she had left it, clean and tidy, and the silence of the house was one of those that makes one hear even their own heart beating. Ada lit the hearth in the darkness by practice, by touch, by the instinct that years of cooking had etched into her hands. And as the first flames illuminated the whitewashed walls, she felt she was doing the right thing. She put water to boil, found a handful of roasted coffee in a tin can, ground it in the mill, and slowly brewed it, letting the strong aroma take over every corner like a silent invitation. Emika appeared at the kitchen door before the coffee was ready with the baby slung over his arm and the expression of someone who hadn't slept enough, but was already used to it. He stood for a moment watching Ada move around the kitchen as if she knew every corner, every pot, every spoon. And something in that scene made him uneasy in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't a bad uneasiness. It was the discomfort of seeing someone occupy a space that had been empty for too long, like when one opens a window after months of being closed and the light floods strongly into the eyes. Ada noticed his presence and offered him coffee without ceremony, already preparing a cup of warm pap for the baby with the care of someone who knows that a small child needs food in just the right measure. Emika accepted the coffee and sat at the table not knowing quite what to say, because morning conversation was not a habit he had kept after Kemi had passed. It was there, over that first morning coffee, that the two struck a deal without needing many words. Emika said he had no money to pay a salary, that the homestead was only producing the bare necessities since he had been alone, that he barely managed with the cattle and the planting without having to rush inside every few minutes for the children. Ada replied that she didn't ask for a salary. She asked for a roof, food, and the right to stay as long as she was useful. She said she knew how to cook, wash, sew, tend a garden, and raise children, and that she wasn't afraid of hard work. Emeka remained silent for a while, turning the cup between his thick hands, and then nodded in that economical way Ada would learn to recognize as his way of saying everything without wasting a syllable. So the agreement was made, simple as a handshake at the gate, and Ada rolled up her sleeves before the sun had fully risen. The first days were of hard work and cautious silence. Ada transformed that abandoned kitchen back into the heart of a home. She got up before everyone, lit the fire, prepared coffee with corn fritters or yam porridge, fed little Cheek with perfectly made pap, and had lunch ready when Emeka returned from the bushland covered in sweat and dust. The house began to smell of people who cared. The pots gleamed again on the wall hook. Clothes appeared washed and folded in the trunks. The compound was swept. The garden, which had become overgrown, was weeded anew. And little by little, new sprouts of cabbage, spring onions, scent leaf, and basil, which Ada planted with seeds she got from a passing trader, began to grow there. Emeka observed everything with an astonishment he tried to hide. He would return from the bushland and find the house transformed each day, the children clean and fed, dinner steaming on the hearth, and he felt such immense gratitude that it sometimes ached in his chest, because gratitude, when mixed with guilt, becomes a knot difficult to untie. Guilt had lived in him since the night Kemi fell ill. It had been a fever that arrived without warning, one of those that rural folk called a bad fever, and that carried away strong people in a matter of days. Emeka was in a distant pasture tending a bull that had fallen into a ditch, and when he returned 2 days later, Kemi was already burning with fever in bed, her eyes glazed, her body trembling under 3 blankets. He rode all night to the village to fetch the herbalist, but by the time they reached the homestead, the fever had already done its desired damage. Kemi lasted 2 more days delirious, calling for the children, and died one rainy morning with Emeka's hands clutching hers. Amara was awake when it happened. She was 5 years old and saw everything from the bedroom door. She saw her father cry for the first time. She saw her mother stop breathing. And from that day on, the girl was no longer a child. It was precisely Amara who was the challenge Ada hadn't foreseen. The girl didn't scream, didn't throw tantrums, didn't cry. She did something worse. She ignored Ada as if she didn't exist. When Ada served a plate, Amara would push it aside and go eat dry Gary with her hands, because dry Gary was what her father used to give her. When Ada tried to comb the girl's tangled hair, she would slip away without a word and go hide behind the chicken pen. When Ada tidied the room, Amara would mess everything up again and put things back in the wrong places where they were before, as if maintaining disorder was keeping her mother alive. It was a silent and fierce resistance, nothing childish about it. And Ada, who had seen pain in many forms, recognized there the most dangerous pain of all, that of someone who refuses to let anything new in for fear of losing again. Ada didn't force, didn't insist with the comb, didn't compel her to eat, didn't try to hug when she wasn't wanted. She simply remained constant like the hearth lit every morning, present like the smell of food at the right time, and let the girl come in her own time if she came at all. Meanwhile, she gave little Cheeky the care the child had needed for months. The baby was thin, irritable, cried a lot at night with colic that kept everyone awake. Ada realized that Amika was feeding the child pure cow's milk, too heavy for such a tiny stomach, and she changed everything. She started diluting the milk, warming it to just the right temperature, adding a pinch of sugar and a dash of local herbal tea, and the colics decreased. In 2 weeks, Chike was sleeping through the night. In a month, he was a different baby, plump, cheerful, stretching his little arms when he saw Ada approach. Amika saw all of this and softened inside without realizing it. He began to return from the bushland earlier, not because the work had diminished, but because the house had once again become a place where one wanted to be. He started talking more during meals, first about things from the farm, then about the children, then about matters that had no particular use, but which filled the silence with something good. Ada listened with genuine attention, asked questions about the cattle, about the crops, about the land, and Amika found himself explaining things with a patience he didn't know he had, almost smiling when she, Akin, a neighboring farmer of advanced age, appeared one Wednesday afternoon, mounted on a worn-out horse that had seen better days, just like its owner. He was a respected man in the region, a widower too, but of an old widowhood, one of those that become a crust around the heart. He had lost his wife more than 15 years ago and never recovered, living alone in a homestead too large for a single man, with farm hands who took care of everything, while he slowly faded away in a rocking chair surrounded by local gin and silence. Elder Akin loved Emeka like a son he never had and came occasionally to check if the young man was bearing up under the weight. That day he found the house different and the young woman in the kitchen, and his eyebrows rose higher than his hat when he took it off. Emeka explained the situation in a few words, and Elder Akin listened in silence, his gaze wandering between the man, the young woman, and the children, with that expression of someone who had lived long enough to know that life weaves tangles that no one plans. The elder didn't say if he approved or disapproved. He simply drank the coffee Ada served. He praised the corn fritters with a grunt that was the closest he came to a compliment. And when it was time to leave, he pulled Amika aside in the compound. What he said was short and direct, that the young woman seemed like a good person, and that the house was better than he had seen it in months, but that the village people had already found out because traders carry news faster than the wind, and that Mama Bose, Kemi's godmother, who owned the shop in the market square, was telling anyone who would listen that Amika had found himself a woman before completing his wife's mourning period. Amika felt his blood heat up, but Elder Akin raised his hand asking for calm and said he wasn't there to judge, that everyone knows the pain they carry and the remedy they need, but that he should be careful because village gossip can destroy more than a flood. That night, after Emeka had retired and the house grew dark, Ada sat on the bed in the small back room with her mother's recipe notebook open on her lap. She turned the pages slowly, reading the notes written in pencil in tiny, sloping script, and each recipe brought with it the ghost of a memory. The orange cake from Sunday afternoons, the rice pudding from the Sala festival, the pap her mother made when Ada fell ill. In the middle of the notebook, between the recipe for shortbread cookies and that for guava jam, there was a torn page. The remaining piece of paper showed it had been ripped out in a hurry, and Ada ran her finger over the ragged edge with an old sadness. It was the recipe for the birthday cake her mother made for her, a cream cake with guava jam that tasted of childhood and belonging. The page had been lost in the move after her mother's death, or perhaps before. Ada never knew. She only knew that since that recipe disappeared, she never celebrated her birthday again, because without that cake, the date was just another empty day. She closed the notebook, put it under her pillow, and put out the kerosene lamp. It was then that she heard the noise, small footsteps in the hallway, light as a cat's paw. Ada lay motionless in bed, holding her breath, and heard the steps stop in the kitchen. She waited a moment, and then slowly got up, walking silently to the door. What she saw clutched her heart in a way she didn't expect. Amara was standing in front of the kitchen window, barefoot, in a white nightgown, her face pressed against the dark glass, looking out. The girl wasn't crying, wasn't making any sound, just standing there, looking towards the dirt path that disappeared into the darkness, waiting. Ada understood without needing an explanation, because some things are understood with the heart and not with the head. Amara was waiting for her mother to come back. Every night, while her father slept the heavy sleep of exhaustion, that 6-year-old girl would get up and go to the window to wait for her mother to appear on the path, because no one had managed to convince her heart that those who go beneath the earth do not return by the path above. Ada returned to her room in silence, without the girl realizing, and lay with her eyes open in the darkness for a long time, feeling the weight of what she now knew. Taking care of that house was not just a matter of a lit hearth and washed clothes. It was a matter of healing wounds that no one saw, that bled in the darkness, that hurt most in those too young to understand what it means to lose forever. The weeks passed with that rhythm of routine that settles in without asking permission, and Amika's homestead began to wear a face it hadn't had in a long time. Ada's garden was already bearing its first fruits. The compound was always swept. The chickens began laying regularly again, because they now had food at the right time, and the house smelled of food all day, because Ada was one of those women who cooked as if praying, with faith that food heals what medicine cannot reach. Amika worked better in the field, since he didn't have to carry the baby tied to his back or rush inside at every cry. The cattle grew fatter. The crops promised a good harvest, and the 2 farmhands who came to help with the heavy work commented among themselves that the master was looking like himself again. But if inside the gate life was settling, on the other side, a storm was slowly brewing, like those summer rains that darken the sky little by little before suddenly breaking. The gossip reached the village before Ada had spent a month at the homestead, and it came in the worst way. From the mouth of someone who believes they own others' morality, Mama Bose, widow of the former shop owner, and now owner herself of the business and all conversations that passed through there, had been Kemi's godmother, Amara's baptismal godmother, and considered herself a guardian of the deceased's memory. She was a woman of loud faith and selective charity, one of those who prayed the rosary at the church door for everyone to see, and talked about others' lives as if it were community service. When a trader who had crossed paths with the young woman on the road commented in the shop that he had seen a young woman entering the widow's homestead, Mama Bose felt she had received a sacred mission. She spent the entire week spreading the news with that tone of false concern that is gossip's favorite disguise, saying that poor Kemi, she barely cooled down, and her husband already put another in her place, that the young woman must be one of those who roam from homestead to homestead looking for widowers with land, that the children were being raised by a stranger with no family and no references. The poison spread through like an oil slick on water, and when Amika appeared at the monthly market fair to sell cheese and buy provisions, he felt the stares before he heard the words. The women whispered behind their stalls. The men averted their faces when he passed, and even the baker, who always saved him fresh bread, pretended he had run out. Amika was not a man to care about others' tongues. He had thick skin for such things. But when he returned to the homestead that afternoon and saw Ada on the veranda with Chike in her arms, softly singing a lullaby while the sun gilded her face, He felt for the first time the fear that this situation might end, that outside pressure might spoil what was working inside. He said nothing to Ada about the market fare. He kept his discomfort in the way men of that time did, pushing worry beneath work, like someone burying a seed and pretending to forget it. But Mama Bose was not a woman to stop at mere gossip. One Friday afternoon, as the sun was losing its strength and Ada had just put the beans to soak for the next day, the sound of a car stopped at the gate, and three women got out with expressions of someone attending a wake. Mama Bose was in front, dressed in black as always, with her rosary around her neck and the Bible under her arm like a war shield. Behind her came two village friends, Folaka and Bimpe, who served more as an audience than anything else. Emeka was in the field, and Ada was alone with the children. When she saw the three women cross the compound towards the house, she felt her stomach clench, but she straightened her back and went to receive them on the veranda with the dignity of someone who owed no one anything. Mama Bose didn't even wait to be invited in. She said she had come to see the children, that as Amara's godmother she had an obligation to ensure her godchildren's welfare, and that the village people were concerned about the situation in that house. The words came out covered in honey, but the poison was in every pause, in every glance Mama Bose cast towards Ada's clothes hanging on the line next to Emeka's shirts, in the way she examined the kitchen looking for flaws, in the way she picked up Cheek from the floor and inspected him as if expecting to find marks of neglect. Ada remained silent, not because she was a coward, but because she knew that a poor woman without family fighting with a woman of position in a small village was a lost battle before it even began. She let Mama Bose wander through the house. She let the friends make gestures and grimaces, and just when she thought the storm would pass without rain, the lightning struck. Mama Bose stopped in front of Kemi's photograph on the living room wall and turned to Ada, her eyes moist with an emotion that was half real and half performance. She said that this was Kemi's house, that this kitchen was Kemi's, that these children were Kemi's, and that no passing stranger had the right to occupy the place of a woman who had only been buried for a few months. Then she looked at Ada with new, lingering attention and said something that chilled her blood. She said it was curious how Ada resembled Kemi, the same kind of hair, the same way of walking, and that perhaps that's why Emeka had accepted her so quickly, because he wasn't looking for a helper, but a copy of his dead wife. The friends fell silent, and the air in the living room grew heavy as before a storm. Ada felt the words hit a spot she didn't know she had, because until that moment, she hadn't noticed the resemblance Mama Bose pointed out. But now, with Kemi's portrait on the wall behind her and Mama Bose's poisonous gaze in front, doubt settled in like a thorn entering the flesh and breaking off inside. Amara appeared in the doorway of the living room amidst all this, drawn by the strange voices, and when she saw her to cry for the first time since Ada had arrived. It wasn't the cry of a child wanting arms. It was the cry of someone recognizing someone from a time that hurt. And Mama Bose took advantage to pick up the girl and cast Ada a look of silent triumph, as if saying that here was proof that children needed familiar people and not a stranger. Ada felt the floor move beneath her feet, but she didn't falter outwardly. She waited for Mama Bose and her friends to leave. She waved goodbye to them from the gate with a steady hand, and only when the car disappeared around the bend in the road did she lean against the wall and let her body slide to the ground, trembling all over. It wasn't anger she felt. It was something worse. It was doubt gnawing from within, asking if Mama Bose wasn't right, if Emeka didn't see her as a shadow of another, if that place truly belonged to her, or if she was just warming a borrowed space. When Emeka returned from the field at the end of the afternoon and found signs of the visit, the poorly made dinner, and Ada with red eyes she tried to hide, he didn't need much explanation to understand what had happened. He remained silent for a long time, eating without tasting, and when Ada got up to clear the plates, he spoke without looking at her, in a low, careful voice of someone who knows they are treading on dangerous ground. He said that Mama Bose didn't rule that homestead and that Ada wasn't going anywhere. Ada stopped with her back to him, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, and asked without turning around if he wanted her there for herself or for resembling someone else. The silence that followed was one that weighed tons. Emeka slowly released his fork, looked at the back of that woman who had saved his house and his children, and felt within his chest a confusion he didn't know how to untangle. He said he had never thought about it, that to him Ada was Ada and Kemi was Kemi, and if there was a resemblance, he hadn't noticed it. But the words came out uncertain, and Ada perceived the hesitation as if it were a blow. She finished washing the dishes in silence and retired to her room without saying good night, and that was the first time the two slept with distance between them, not of meters, but of unresolved matters. The following days were strange and tense, with Ada working harder than ever, but speaking less than ever, and Emeka circling the house with guilt, not knowing what to apologize for. He found himself looking at Kemi's photograph on the wall, and then looking at Ada in the kitchen, comparing unintentionally, searching for the resemblance Mama Bose had planted in his head, and getting angry with himself for not being able to stop. Ada noticed the glances and withdrew even more, and the house that had begun to breathe again started to suffocate anew. Amara, with the sharp intuition that wounded children develop, felt the change in the air and became sullen again, as if Mama Bose's visit had reopened the wound that had barely begun to heal. The girl stopped eating Ada's food again. She went back to peeling cassava alone in the compound. She returned to long silences and hard stares. It was as if the entire house was moving backward, undoing knot by knot everything Ada had so carefully woven. It was in this stretched cord atmosphere that the longest night of that homestead arrived. Cheek began to cough after dinner, a dry cough that turned into a cold and before midnight became a fever. Ada touched the child's forehead and recognized the dangerous heat she had felt many times caring for Auntie Ngozi. She prepared elderberry tea, made wet cloth compresses, held the child in her arms, trying to lower his temperature with everything she knew, but the fever did not yield. Cheeky burned like an ember, his little body shaking with chills, his breath coming out with a wheezing sound that filled the house with fear. Emeka, seeing his son in that state, felt terror rise up his back like a living thing, because that scene was an exact repetition of what had happened with Kemi. The same fever, the same trembling, the same glazed eyes. The memory returned whole, cruel, and with it came the panic of someone who already knows how this story can end. Emeka grabbed his hat and said he was going to fetch the herbalist in the village, that he wasn't going to wait until dawn, that he wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. Ada tried to argue that the path was dark and that it had rained in the afternoon, that the route would be dangerous, but she saw in his eyes something that allowed no discussion. It was the desperation of a father who had already lost too much and could not bear to lose anything more. He saddled the horse in the dark, mounted without looking back, and disappeared into the path like a shadow swallowed by the night. Ada was left alone with the two children, the baby burning with fever in her arms, and Amara sleeping in her room unaware of anything. The house became enormous around her, every shadow seeming larger, every sound from the bushland outside seeming like a threat, and Ada prayed softly as she changed the compresses, asking God not to take anyone else from that house that had already paid more than its share of suffering. It was around 2 a.m. when the worst happened, not with Chaiki, who was still feverish but stable in Ada's arms, but with Amara. The girl woke up to the sound of her brothers crying, left her room and came to the kitchen, and what she saw collapsed her world. She saw Ada holding the baby who was trembling and moaning. She saw the wet compresses. She saw the tea on the table. She saw the kerosene lamp casting shadows on the wall and all of that mixed in the head of a 6-year-old girl with the night her mother died. Amara's body froze in the kitchen doorway. Her eyes widened enormously, and then came the scream, a high-pitched, tearing scream, not of fright, but of pure terror. The terror of someone reliving the worst night of their life and unable to separate what is past from what is present. The girl began to tremble from head to toe, slid to the floor, and huddled against the wall with her arms wrapped around her knees, crying in a way that didn't seem like a child's cry, but like the lament of a wounded animal. Ada felt desperation squeeze her because she had a sick baby in one arm and a panicked girl on the floor and was alone in the middle of the night with no one to help her. But desperation is a luxury a mother cannot afford. And that was exactly what Ada became at that hour without realizing it, without planning it, without asking permission. She carefully laid Cheek in the crib, covered the child, and knelt on the floor beside Amara. The girl huddled closer, recoiling from contact like a cornered animal, and Ada didn't insist. She stayed there on the floor, sitting beside her, not touching her, not speaking, just present, like a warm wall protecting from the wind, demanding nothing in return. And she began to sing. It was a song her mother used to sing on stormy nights, a simple, repetitive melody that wasn't meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be safe, to be the same every time, to say without words that as long as that music played, nothing bad would happen. Ada sang for a long time, repeating the same song as if it were a prayer, and little by little so slowly that it was almost imperceptible. Amara's body stopped trembling. Her crying diminished. Her sobs spaced out, and the girl began to relax the knees she held tight against her chest. At some point that neither of them could pinpoint, Amara leaned her head on Ada's shoulder. First, she just leaned it, light as a bird alighting, and then she let go completely, letting the weight of her small body fall against that woman who smelled of soap and herbal tea. Ada stopped singing and remained still, feeling the girl's heart beat fast against her arm, and heard when Amara whispered with a voice destroyed from crying so much, a single word that changed everything between them. Stay. It wasn't a request. It wasn't an order. It was surrender. It was a 6-year-old girl saying with the only words she could that she couldn't bear to lose any more people, that she couldn't bear to wait at the window anymore, that if that woman left like her mother had left, she wouldn't survive again. Ada held the girl tight against her chest and cried silently with her, because some pains only pass when one shares them with someone who understands. Dawn found the two asleep on the kitchen floor, leaning against the wall. Amara curled up in Ada's lap like a puppy who had finally found refuge. Cheeky slept in the crib nearby, his breathing calmer, his fever visibly lower. This is how Amika found them when he arrived with the village herbalist almost at sunrise, drenched in rain and mud, his horse exhausted. He stopped at the kitchen door and stood looking at that scene, unable to move, because what he saw was not an employee caring for children who were not hers. It was a mother holding his children as if they were the most precious things in the world. The herbalist examined Chike, said it was a throat infection, that the fever would subside with the teas and compresses Ada was already administering, that the young woman had acted well, and that the child would be fine in a few days. Amika thanked the healer, paid for the visit with cheese and butter, because money was scarce. And when they were alone again, he looked at Ada with a clarity he hadn't felt since Kemi's death. In that moment, kneeling beside the chair where Ada was now sitting with Amara still asleep in her lap, Amika understood that the question about the resemblance to Kemi was the wrong question. It didn't matter if Ada resembled Kemi or any other person in the world. What mattered was that she had stayed, that in the darkest hour, when he wasn't there, she had held everything together alone. She held the house. She held the sick baby. She held the shattered girl. And that was not something of someone who resembles someone. It was something of someone who is someone. He said nothing because he hadn't yet found the right words, but he touched Ada's hand with the tip of his calloused fingers, and she raised her tired eyes. And what passed between those two gazes was more than any phrase could carry. Something changed in that homestead after that night, and it wasn't something that could be seen with the eyes, but it was felt in the air as rain is felt before it falls. Emeka woke up different the next morning, with a firmness in his gaze that Ada didn't know, a decision that seemed to have been born during the ride in the dark and matured upon seeing the two women of his life sleeping on the kitchen floor. He drank his coffee in silence. He looked at Amara, who for the first time in weeks sat beside Ada at the table and ate her corn fritters without a complaint. He looked at Cheeky, who already showed improvement in the crib with less red cheeks, and then he stood up, put on his hat, and said he was going to the village to sort some things out. He didn't explain what things they were, and Ada didn't ask because she had learned that Emeka was a man who spoke with actions and not with promises. What Emeka did that morning, the entire village knew before noon. He went straight to the chapel and sought out Pastor John, a thin man with white hair and gentle eyes, who had known Emeka since he was a child and had baptized his two children, performed his wedding with Kemi, and committed her body to the earth. Emeka sat on the front pew of the empty church and told the pastor everything with the raw honesty of someone who doesn't know how to sugarcoat things. He told him about Ada, about the work arrangement, about the children's improvement, about Mama Bose's visit and the gossip, and he also told him, in a softer voice and with hands clutching his hat in his lap, that he felt something for that woman that he hadn't expected to feel again, and that he didn't know if he had the right to feel. Pastor John listened to everything without interrupting, as men do who have learned that listening is more important than advising. And when Emeka finished, the pastor remained silent for a while, looking at the crucifix on the altar before speaking. What the pastor said was simple, and Emeka carried those words for the rest of his life. He said that mourning is not a prison, and that God did not invent nostalgia to prevent anyone from living, that honoring those who have left is not to wither alongside them, it is to remain standing, caring for what remains. He said that Kemi had been a good wife and a good mother, but that she was with God and that the children were on earth needing living care and not dead homage. He said that if Ada was a good woman, and if Emeka felt in his heart what he was saying with his mouth, then he should do things properly, that he should marry her before God and the community, that he should give her the respect of a wife and not the shame of a cohabitant. Emeka left the church with a lighter chest than when he entered and went to make his second visit of the day. He stopped his cart in front of Mama Bose's shop when business was brisk, with half a dozen people buying and chatting on the sidewalk. Mama Bose saw him arrive and straightened behind the counter, ready for the confrontation she knew was coming. But what Emeka did surprised her. He didn't yell, he didn't accuse, he didn't threaten. He entered the shop calmly, took off his hat out of politeness, and spoke loudly enough for everyone inside to hear. He said that Mama Bose had been Kemi's godmother and that he respected that, but that respect ended where interference began. He said that Ada was an honorable woman who had saved his children from hunger and from growing up without care, that she had done more for that family in weeks than the whole village had done in a year of his widowhood, because no one, not even Mama Bose, with all the concern she claimed to have, had shown up to help when he was drowning. The silence in the shop was deafening. Mama Bose opened her mouth to reply, but Emeka continued. He said that he was going to marry Ada, that Pastor John already knew, and that the marriage banns would be read on Sunday, and that whoever wanted to talk could talk their fill because gossip never stopped a decent person's wedding. He said all that looking Mama Bose in the eyes with a firmness that admitted no reply, and then he put his hat back on. He bought his goods at the counter, paid precisely, and left. People in the shop looked at each other not knowing what to say, and Mama Bose, for the first time in years, was left speechless. Not because she lacked words, but because deep down in that chest covered in rosaries and judgment, something recognized that Amika was right. She hadn't shown up to help. None of them had. And sometimes the truth hurts more than any offense. Amika returned to the homestead in the early afternoon and found Ada in the garden, kneeling in the soil, weeding among the cabbage plants, with Cheek sitting on a mat nearby, and Amara, for the first time, playing close to her, not with her, but close, which was already an enormous conquest. He got out of the car, walked to the garden, and stood watching that scene for a moment, engraving it in his memory, because he knew he was about to change everything and wanted to remember how it was before it changed. Ada looked up and saw something different in his face. A lightness she didn't know, and she waited without getting up, her hands dirty with soil and her heart racing without knowing why. Amika knelt before her right there in the garden among the cabbage and spring onion plants, with the smell of damp earth rising around them, and spoke in the only way he knew how, without embellishments, without a speech, without kneeling on one knee, like in the novels he had never read. He said he had gone to the village to speak with the pastor, and that he wanted to marry her if she accepted. He said he couldn't promise the world because his world was small. It was just that homestead, those cattle, those children, but that he shared all of it with an open heart. He said he knew she had arrived there asking only for dinner and a roof, and that he was incapable of offering pretty words, but he could offer a surname, a real home, and the certainty that she would never again need to sleep without knowing where she would wake up. Ada looked at him, her eyes filled with tears and her mouth trembling, and for a long moment she said nothing because the words were all jumbled in her throat, unable to come out in order. Then she asked, her voice breaking, if he wanted to marry her, Ada, and not the memory of another person. Amika understood the weight of that question and held her face between his large hands that still had dust from the road. He looked into her brown eyes, which were not like Kemi's, because Kemi's were light, and her nose, which was not the same, because Kemi's was fine, and her mouth, which was not the same, because Kemi's was smaller, and he said that he was looking at her, only at her, that it was Ada who had lit the hearth of his home again. It was Ada who had taught his son to sleep. It was Ada who had held his daughter on the kitchen floor when the world was falling apart, and that it was with Ada that he wanted to grow old on that veranda. She said yes without speaking the word, because the yes came out as both a cry and a laugh at the same time. And Amara, who was close enough to hear everything, watched from a distance with that seriousness that was her trademark. Ada looked at the girl and extended her soil-stained hand, not forcing, not pulling, just offering as she had done from the first day. Amara stood still for an instant that seemed to last all the time in the world, and then she walked slowly, step by step, and took Ada's hand, her small fingers squeezing tight. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Amika looked at their intertwined hands and knew that this was the missing blessing, more important than the pastor's, more important than the whole village's. The wedding was set for 3 weeks later, enough time for the bands and for Ada to sew a decent dress with fabric Amika bought in the village. Pastor John read the banns the next 2 Sundays, and no one came forward to object. Although Ada was sure Mama Bose would be in the front row to object, Mama Bose did not appear in church on either Sunday, and Ada learned later from Elder Aiken that the shop owner had remained silent since the day Amika spoke to her, and that some of the village friends had begun to change their tune, saying that, after all, the widower was right, and that no one had gone to help when he needed it. People are like that, my dear friends. They turn to where the wind changes, and sometimes it's enough for one person to speak the truth aloud for the castle of gossip to crumble entirely. The wedding day dawned with that clean September sky that only the countryside knows. A blue so beautiful it hurt with a warm breeze that carried the scent of orange blossoms from the garden. The ceremony would be simple in the village chapel with few guests. Elder Akin would be Amika's best man, and the wife of the oldest farmhand would be Ada's matron of honor, as she had no family to fill that role. Ada got ready in the small back room that would soon cease to be solely hers. She put on her new dress of raw cotton with a little lace at the neck that she herself had embroidered at night after the children fell asleep. She braided her hair with orange blossoms that Amara had cut from the garden, and it was precisely that detail that made Ada cry before the ceremony. The flowers had appeared on her bed early, without a note, without explanation. But Ada knew it had been Amara because no one else woke up before the sun in that house. In the church, Emeka waited in the suit that only came out of the trunk on special occasions, the same one he had worn to marry Kemi. And he didn't hide it or apologize for it because for Emeka, wearing that suit was not repeating the past. It was showing that life continues on the same foundations and that this takes nothing away from anyone. When Ada entered the chapel holding a bouquet of wildflowers with Amara walking beside her, advancing with her head held high because she had no father to give her away, but she had the dignity to walk alone. Emeka felt his eyes sting and was not ashamed. Pastor John officiated the ceremony with words that spoke of new beginnings and courage, of hands reaching out in the darkness and finding other hands. And when he declared them husband and wife, Amara, sitting in the first pew with Chiki in her lap, did something no one in that church expected. She smiled, a small, almost invisible smile, but it was the first smile of that child in over a year, and whoever saw it felt that something was happening there that went beyond a wedding. It was a family being mended anew with new thread on old fabric. The celebration was at the homestead with a table set in the compound under the shade of the large tree. Simple and abundant food that Ada had prepared in the previous days with the help of neighbors who had finally accepted the situation. There was party rice, chicken stew, bean porridge, puff-puff, palm wine, and freshly brewed coffee. The few guests ate and chatted until the sun set, and when they left, the homestead was left in that good silence of a peaceful, full house. Ada was clearing the plates in the compound when she felt someone tugging at the edge of her dress. She looked down and saw Amara with a folded paper in her hand, extending it to her with that solemnity children have when doing something they consider very important. Ada knelt down and took the paper. She unfolded it slowly, and what she found made her legs weak. It was a recipe written in round, uncertain, childish handwriting full of errors and ink smudges, but perfectly legible. Cream cake with guava jam. Ada looked at Amara without understanding, her heart beating so hard it seemed to want to burst from her chest, and the girl explained in that breathless way of children who have much to say and little practice in saying it. She recounted that she had seen Ada looking at the recipe notebook many nights, running her finger over that torn page, and that one day she asked Mama Bose at the shop if she knew the recipe for cream cake with guava jam, because Mama Bose had an old recipe notebook that belonged to her mother. Mama Bose, who no one expected to help with anything, searched her notebook. She found a similar recipe and dictated it to Amara to copy one afternoon when the girl went to the village with Emeka. The girl had kept the paper under her pillow for days, waiting for the right moment, and decided that the wedding was the moment, because a wedding is a day for gifts, and that was the gift she wanted to give. Ada held that paper like a sacred relic, and tears fell unbidden, thick and hot, wetting her new dress and the recipe in Amara's hands, which she squeezed between her own. It wasn't just a recipe, my dear friends. It was the missing bridge. It was the girl saying she accepted Ada not as a substitute for her mother, but as someone new to love. It was the page missing from the notebook and from life, and it was Mama Bose back in the village with all her flaws and all her sharp tongue, showing that beneath judgment sometimes lies a heart that knows how to do the right thing when a child asks. Emeka found the two embracing in the compound, Ada kneeling, holding Amara against her chest, both crying and laughing, and he knelt beside them and enveloped them in an embrace that also included Chiki sleeping in the hammock, and the memory of Kemi, who didn't need to be forgotten for life to move forward. The months that followed the wedding were of learning and strengthening bonds. Ada ceased to be just the young woman who helped and became the true mistress of the house, the one who decided the menu, who managed the pantry, who negotiated fabric prices at the shop, who advised on where to plant and when to harvest. Amika discovered that sharing decisions was not weakness. It was intelligence, because Ada had a practical sense he admired and a courage to take risks that he alone would not have had. The homestead grew in those months as it hadn't in years. They bought more chickens, expanded the garden, sold cheese at the market fair with profits that were enough to repair the roof, and replace the old windows with glass windows that let in the morning sun. Cheek grew strong and healthy. He became a clever child who chased chickens and called Ada Mama with the naturalness of someone who had never known another. Amara slowly blossomed like a flower that needs time and patience. And little by little she stopped being the old child who peeled cassava in silence to become a creature playing in the garden, inventing stories, laughing at silly things. And one full moon night, Ada realized that Amara no longer went to the kitchen window to wait for her mother to return. The girl slept through the night, peaceful. And that was the greatest victory Ada achieved in that house, greater than any harvest or repair. Elder Akin, the neighbor who lived alone ruminating on his own widowhood, began to frequent the homestead more regularly after the wedding. He would come for Sunday lunch that Ada prepared with festive care, and would stay all afternoon on the veranda chatting with Amika and playing with the children in a clumsy way of someone who lacked practice but had the desire. Ada noticed that the old man was changing, that living with a vibrant family was thawing something within him that solitude had hardened. On one of those Sundays, Elder Aiken confessed to Amika, his voice thick with local gin and emotion, that he had been wrong to shut himself in mourning for so many years, that his wife would not have wanted to see him rot alone in a house too large, and that seeing Amika have the courage to start anew had been a slap and a lesson at the same time. Amika said nothing, only refilled the old man's glass again, because in the countryside some things are better said in shared silence than in any speech. A year and a half after the wedding, on a summer afternoon when the heat made the air shimmer over the land, Ada called Amika to sit on the veranda and told him, her hands trembling in her lap, that she was expecting a child. Amika remained still for an instant, with the empty expression of someone receiving news too big for his face to grasp. And then he smiled in a way Ada had never seen before, a smile that was whole, without shadow, without reservation, without any ghost behind it. He embraced her right there on the veranda, with the strength of someone embracing proof that life had not given up on him. And Ada felt in the squeeze of those arms that the question about resembling Kemi had died once and for all, buried by everything they had built together. The child was born the following spring, a boy they named Anthony in honor of Ada's father, whom the road had taken too soon, but whom she never forgot. Mama Bose sent a handmade knitted outfit as a gift with a short note that simply said, "For the child, with wishes for health." And Ada kept that note along with the recipe Amara had copied, because they were proof that people can change when time and truth do their work. The years passed with the haste that years have when life is truly lived. Chike grew up and became a hard-working young man who helped his father in the field with Amika's same silent dedication. Amara became a beautiful and studious young woman who learned to read with Pastor John and then taught the neighborhood children under the big tree in the compound because the village had no school and she decided she would do it. Anthony, the youngest, grew up hearing that he had two parents in heaven, his grandfather, the trader, and Aunt Kemi, who watched over the stars, and never felt that this patched-up family was any less a family than any other. The homestead prospered, becoming the largest in the region, with good pasture, fat cattle, a garden that bore fruit all year round, and a large house with open windows where there were always people at the table and food on the hearth. Elder Akin spent his last years frequenting that house as if he were a borrowed grandfather, and when he died of old age one winter night, It was Ameka who handled the burial, and Ada who cooked for the wake, because true family is not just blood. Much later, when Emeka's hair had turned completely white and Ada's hands already bore the marks of a lifetime of work, the two sat on the same veranda where everything had been decided. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky with that orange that only the countryside knows, and the homestead around them was alive with the sound of grandchildren running in the compound and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Amara, who was now a grown woman with her own family, had come to visit with her children. Cheek was in the cattle pen with his father, showing his eldest son how to milk a cow. Anthony sent letters from the city where he had gone to study, and in each letter came a piece of nostalgia and the promise to return. Ada looked at all of it, the house she had found dead and helped to revive, the garden she had planted, the crops that had grown, and felt a peace so profound it hurt with its beauty. Emeka took her hand as he did every afternoon on that veranda, intertwining his calloused fingers with hers, and asked if she remembered the day she arrived. Ada smiled and said she remembered everything: the cold hearth, the crying baby, the serious girl in the compound, and the enormous fear she felt that they would send her back in the morning. Emeka shook his head slowly and said that his fear that day was different. It was the fear of accepting help, of admitting he couldn't do it alone, of letting someone into a house he had locked up with his grief. Ada leaned her head on his shoulder and murmured softly the phrase she had said so many years ago: "If you let me stay, I can make dinner." Emeka laughed with that low, husky laugh of an old man who has cried all he had to cry and now only knows how to laugh. He replied that she had done much more than dinner, that she had made the entire house, the entire family, the entire life. And Ada squeezed his hand and said that she hadn't done it alone, that he had left the gate open that afternoon, and that sometimes that's all God asks of you, not great feats, not miracles, only that you open the gate when someone needs to enter. And so ends this story, my dear friends, which is not about love at first sight, not about passion born in a lightning flash and dying in a storm. It is about love built at the hearth, lit at dawn, in the hand that holds a child on a feverish night, in the plate set at the exact time, in the silence that says more than a speech. Emeka and Ada. What does the name matter? Because this story happens every time someone has the courage to extend a hand and someone has the courage to accept it. If this story touched your heart as it touched mine in telling it, hit that like button now. Subscribe here to the Tales of Old Times channel. Activate the bell icon and share it with someone who needs to hear that starting over is not weakness. It is the bravest thing there is. Tell me in the comments what moment touched you the most. Was it Amara's scream on the kitchen floor? Was it the marriage proposal in the garden? Or was it that folded paper with the recipe the girl kept under her pillow? I want to know what stayed in your heart. And always remember, sometimes you think you're just asking for a plate of food, but God knows what you truly need is a home. Until the next story, stay with God, and may He bless your house just as He blessed Emeka and Ada's.